France and Belgium, both in emergency mode. Civil liberties have been suspended for 3 months. The police can go into any home at any time for any reason until the end of February. In new developments, Belgian police have seized chemicals from an apartment outside of Brussels. And in Paris, the police have increased security at key water supply sites. 2 local journalists are reporting that chemical and biological protective suits were stolen from a hospital. Retired intelligence officer Lieutenant Colonel Bill Cowan with me now. Colonel, a French government official said, no need to fool ourselves. What we have in front of us is a complete failure. And he is referencing the inability to link the terrorists, rather, who attacked Paris. Do you think a non-hackable info sharing system should be the top priority?
Well, I think it has to be, Deirdre. Right here in the United States, too, we all have to be able to get into those systems through which ISIS and others are communicating and be able to break them down. Unfortunately, out there in the commercial sector, all those companies that have really a tight, well-done encryption systems aren't prepared to share how to get into those systems. So I think we're going to have a long battle here in the U.S., as they are overseas, about how to get these private companies to open up so that at least governments, with warrants if necessary, can look at specific emails and specific traffic.
And it also seems to be able to connect the would-be terrorists via social media and alert, as unfortunately it happened after the fact in this case. Speaking of which, the FBI, Colonel, recently released a video from Moldova where criminals were trying to sell nuclear material to terrorists. How much dangerous nuclear or chemical material do you think is available that's usable in the underground market?
Well, on the nuclear side, radioactive material has limited use unless it's with a bomb. I mean, you can scare people with a dirty bomb, which spews radioactive material, but realistically speaking, it's pretty difficult to move large quantities of that without either being caught or putting the person who's carrying it at terrible risk. But on chemical or biological, that's a different story. We know already that ISIS has mustard gas that they captured from Assad's stockpiles in Syria. We believe that they probably also have chlorine gas, and we know also that there's a university in Mosul and a university in Raqqa that were very upscale universities, a lot of smart chemical and chemists, and biologists there. So there's always the opportunity for ISIS to get their hands on things that they don't have or may have and use it in Europe or here in the United States.
Okay, Colonel, speaking of Europe and the U.S. and comparing the two, France has about 60 million citizens. The country has declared war on ISIS. Some are critical of the United States, wondering why the U.S., with its 320 million citizens, has not spoken in stronger terms.
They're a bunch of killers with good social media. And they are dangerous, and they've caused great hardship to people.
Colonel, in your view, does this downplay the threat, or is the president trying to manage the situation, that is to say, not glorify these barbarians?
I think he downplays the threat. I don't think he personally or those around him who advise him have taken the threat seriously. I certainly believe that we have a lot of people in the Pentagon that have taken it seriously. But until the United States itself is struck as hard as Paris was struck, I don't believe we're going to see a lot of action on the part of this administration.
We had our Paris. It was 9/11.
Oh, that's true, Deirdre, under a different administration. And you know, between then and now, things have gotten pretty quiet. People are pretty complacent. Of course, our law enforcement and our intelligence personnel are working as hard as ever, if not harder than ever. But I think from the White House itself, there's still kind of this sense that it's not as serious as it seems. At least it's not as serious on this side. But I dare say it will get there.
Yeah, I mean, having been in Paris, I can attest to the fact that it very much touched the soul of the people living in that city, and in some cases, friends and family. Western leaders, Colonel, agreeing to extend sanctions against Russia by another 6 months. How do you see this strategically, since in some ways, love him or hate him, Putin is seen by the world as the one person who can get ISIS under control?
Yeah, that you just said it, love him or hate him. I mean, we see right now that Putin is standing up and showing himself to be much more of a leader with his forces against ISIS than we have been up to this point. And so while we may have sanctions on him for things he's done, such as the Ukraine, by the same token, we've got to pat him on the back and prop him up a little bit and forge relationships with him, particularly when we see our military forces and his military forces operating in the same area. We have to forge relationships that we would never, under other circumstances, even consider forming. And against that backdrop, remember, in Syria, he has different ulterior motives than we do. Although we both want to get rid of ISIS, he wants Assad to stay in power. We want Assad out. So a lot of conflict and at the same time a lot of necessity to find ways to try to work together to defeat the common enemy.
Well, Colonel, when I was in Paris last week and speaking to some very old-timers, they said nobody liked Stalin either, but he was the one person who helped to check Hitler. And I think a lot of people, at least there, who had parents or grandparents alive at that time, are somehow feeling exactly the way that you just described the president of Russia, Putin. Staying on Russia, in some ways blaming the U.S. for creating ISIS. I'm going to read you a quote here from the Russian prime minister saying, quote, strengthening of ISIS became possible partially due to irresponsible policies of the U.S. instead of concentrating joint efforts on fighting terrorism. The U.S. and its allies decided to fight against the lawfully elected president of Bashar Assad. And you just referenced that, Colonel, that we, the U.S. and Russia, have a completely opposing view of the Syrian president. But was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 to blame? I've heard people say it was like taking the garbage can lid off the trash can when Saddam Hussein was taken out of his position.
Yeah, you know, unfortunately, from my perspective, Saddam was the one that kind of kept Iran in check, and now Iran turns out to be the strongest nation in the entire Middle East and maybe on their way to getting nuclear weapons. You can argue, though, you can't argue with some of the points. We had an opportunity, we, the United States, under this administration, we had an opportunity to identify ISIS for the problem it was. The president was getting, and the chain of command was getting warnings from the intelligence community that ISIS was bad, that they were capable, they were powerful, they were growing. And in effect, we really did nothing until ISIS popped up 2 years ago, right now almost. They were nothing, and suddenly they owned a good large portion of territory over there. So I think there's a credible argument that the United States failed totally in trying to thwart ISIS when it started out in its early years. And we can still go back and debate a little bit about whether we were responsible for the Assad regime, for Syria falling apart. We may bear some responsibility. Remember the red line, chemical weapons. The president says if Assad ever uses chemical weapons again, we're going to do something about it. It's unacceptable. When he did use them, continues to use them, and nothing was ever done. So I think from that point forward, most people in the world would look at us and say we were pretty weak.
Yeah, including Syrians, from what I understand, are disappointed. To your point that after that red line was crossed, we really didn't do anything.